go live right away. See if it links us to the right spot. We got the live stream all set up and going now. Give me a second. Just want to verify. Okay, it says we are live. That's cool. We actually showed up. Cool. All right, cool. Welcome. Sorry for the delays getting the live stream set up. Had some additional work on the back end here to do. We're joined here on Truth from Earth by Austin Hepworth. Do you want to give yourself an introduction?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Seth. It's good to be here with you. I am Austin. I'm an attorney here in Utah. I'm licensed in Utah and California, and I've been an attorney for about 14 and a half years. And I love our country. I love America and what it stands for. I love the Constitution. And I am, I guess, a father of 8 children. I am involved in a fair amount of the politics here in Utah, trying to stay close to what's happening there. I ran for Attorney General as an independent last year. And then I have a constitutional case against the US government over Corporate Transparency Act, and also work with business owners, entrepreneurs, liberty-minded people. And so just enjoy the ability to have a good conversation, the ability to talk about our important the important principles here in the country and the laws and things. And so I'm grateful to be on with you, Seth.
Sounds great. Awesome. Yeah, so this is really part of just my passion, frankly, to dive into constitutional subjects and make sure we are aware of what our rights and responsibilities are. There's a talk, or really a book by Dallin H. Oaks, where he talks about rights and responsibilities. He says that for every right that we would claim, there are corresponding responsibilities. And that's just part of growing up, growing up in a real world with the government is we realize there are things that we need to do in order to keep the place clean, in order to get the dishes done, in order to prevent fights and mayhem and all that stuff. And so I think that's something that we've really both been very focused on is what are the responsibilities we need to live up to in order to safeguard our rights.
Yeah, I definitely think that's something that we don't talk about enough is our responsibilities. Our liberties disappear if we let go of our personal responsibilities. So.
For sure. Yeah. And that's something that's very deeply concerning right now because I'm like, I talk to so many people and they're just like, oh, don't worry. The guy in the White House has got it all taken care of. And I'm like, no, that's not the way freedom is secured. So we're going to dive more into that today. Just a really quick kind of flyby question here. You're talking about Corporate Transparency Act. I think for a lot of people who just aren't well versed in that space, like most of us probably, just what does that even mean? Like most of us are consumers. We live in a very consumer centric society rather than a producer society. So what is the Corporate Transparency Act that you're working on?
Yeah, and in a nutshell, the Corporate Transparency Act is a requirement from the federal government that if you have an entity, an LLC, a corporation, something like that, and it makes under $5 million a year, the federal government labeled you as a national security threat because they say that you are helping to launder money and promote terrorism. And so they're requiring that every small business owner in America disclose who has actual ownership in the company to the federal government and disclose everyone that can directly or indirectly substantially control the company. And that's quite concerning because there's many people that may be able to indirectly control a company. For example, if you're married, your spouse most likely has a decent amount of indirect or direct control, even if they're not listed. But the purpose of it, from my perspective, is that the federal government wants to know who the entrepreneurs associate with, who they're closely associated with. And it's looking to know the close associations in those circles. And it's mandating that you provide the name, address, date of birth, I think, and a photo ID to the government, driver's license or passport for these people that you're close to. And if you don't, or if something changes, such as an address or whatnot, and you don't update it within 30 days, you can be fined up to $500 a day for noncompliance. It's pretty heavy hand. And one of the most concerning aspects of it is that the law openly states the federal government can use the information for law enforcement purposes. And so they can share it with any federal agency they want to pursue actions against you or against people you're associated with. And they can share it with international or with other countries. So they can share it internationally without warrants or anything like that. So you're mandated to provide information to the government, and then they can share it. And so a couple examples, if you look at things like the Paris Olympics, there was a boxer competing with the females that hit one of the females, and the female dropped out and said, "Whoa, this is the hardest hit I've ever had." And the news started looking at it, and the boxer had high testosterone levels or something and had failed a gender test at a previous match. And so a bunch of people were took to social media talking about how it's so unfair that there's men beating up on women. And at the end, the story from the news, and I don't profess to have the complete story, but the story from the news was that it actually was a girl, just had higher testosterone levels, something like that. I don't know. Um, but France, Paris, France, during the Olympics, this boxer filed a criminal complaint, and the French prosecutor picked it up and said, "We're going to go after everybody who said anything online about this boxer because that violates French law, and you can go to jail for it." And so people like Musk, Trump, J.K. Rowling's, some very high-profile people, but he claimed he would use all tools at his disposal in international law. And so if a company tweeted something about this, France would be able to request to the US to say, who are all the people associated with that company? And then they could issue an arrest warrant for every one of them. And if you happen to fly to France or anywhere in the EU, you would then be picked up without even knowing there was an arrest warrant for you. We watched this happen too in Brazil with Brazil upset at Twitter because Twitter wouldn't take certain things down that Brazil wanted them to. And so Brazil seized Starlink's assets simply because they had a connection in Musk, but the two companies are very different. And so again, this is something that's happening where you can't get one person directly, so you go after someone else or someone they're associated with, it spreads. And the government, when they want to know who the entrepreneurs are, who they're associated with, and they've labeled them a national security threat, it makes me deeply worried about everything they're up to. So we have a case challenging that. 3 courts so far have struck it down as unconstitutional, but the U.S. Supreme Court recently said the government, you can still enforce it while these appeals wind through the courts on this. But after the Supreme Court said that, at about the same time, another judge struck it down as unconstitutional. So it's still kind of in limbo. It's not being enforced at the moment, but it's something for all business owners to be aware of.
Yeah, that's pretty terrifying, and that's rich too with the federal government with their their money printing machine, accusing small businesses of potential money laundering and saying they need to be on a basically a national security threat watch list for that, and
Yeah.
and then there's that element of globalism to it as well, saying, oh, let's go and get other nations to come and dogpile you to try to force compliance. That's kind of ridiculous. People
Yeah,
just
it's pretty extreme. And again, there's just no care or concern for the Fourth Amendment at all. Um, no warrants, no probable cause. We're just taking it all from you because we want it.
Yeah, well, that's very very horrifying. But as I've been coming to learn, the fight is real. The fight with sin is real, and like to your point about the war in heaven, you actually have a series on the war in heaven, don't you?
Yeah, I have a full-length novel as well as some short stories that support it, and then I'm working on a sequel. I also have a podcast series on the War in Heaven as well.
That sounds really cool. Can you just tell me just high level?
Yeah, so I guess maybe to introduce it slightly, if I ask people why um, why a third part of the hosts of heaven followed Satan, most people say because they were deceived. And I don't believe that at all. Because if a third part of the hosts of heaven were deceived and then were cast out of heaven and doomed to some everlasting punishment as a result of being deceived, there would be a serious justice issue with God. There would also be a serious issue of, well, why couldn't God have corrected the deception? Why couldn't he have shown them what was wrong with what Satan was proposing? And I believe very strongly that um, if we really understand light and dark, we really understand our desires, agency, that type of thing, we start to understand that life is about more than deception. Satan does more than deceive. He actually offers people something, and some people do want that. It's why there is a real battle between good and evil. And we have to understand what's at stake. We have to understand why people would choose Satan's path and reject God, to fully understand and appreciate all that's going on. And so in it, I went through and I wrote a fictional story of heaven, premortal life. And it's not intended to pretend like I know what it was like or anything. It's more as a parable. If we have the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I don't personally know if that story is true or not. If there really was this guy that did this, or if Jesus used the story as an example. But my book is meant to be kind of the same way. There's a story, whether it's true or not, isn't a big deal to me, but it really helps to highlight the principles. And it goes through, and I try to talk about many aspects of the gospel in support of the gospel, but putting them in a light that helps us see them from a different perspective, to see why we would have a lot of the pieces, why faith is necessary, why opposition is necessary, why sacrifice is necessary, to go through prophets, to go through all types of things that some people, or it's not uncommon for people to struggle with at different times, and to put them in a light and frame them in relation to agency. And a big part of it is to really dive into agency, how critical it is, and why God gives it to us. But ultimately, the point of it all is to really push something that I believe strongly, and that is that good is stronger than evil. And we often feel um, very overwhelmed. We often feel like we don't know what to do because it seems like there's so much out there and the forces are so strong and all that. But we have to remember that light wins, God wins, and when we feed truth, when we promote truth, when we speak truth, truth prevails, because ultimately people choose. And most people, I still believe very strongly, when presented with truth, will eventually act on it. And it's up to us. This is one of our responsibilities. If you look at Doctrine and Covenants, it's extensive. God says, you're called to preach, you're called to preach, you're called to preach, to cry repentance. And I think he's saying, your words are powerful. Your words can change and shape people, communities, nations. So speak up and don't be afraid to. And I believe very strongly with the war in heaven that so much of it was based around speech or silence. And so a large part of me talking about the war in heaven and taking people in to explore in depth the principles associated with it is to really try and help people understand that we are powerful beings. We influence and impact the world around us by the things that we say and do. And we can't sit by. We have a responsibility to act. And if we act, good things happen, even if it's not immediate. The good comes.
Absolutely. Give me a second. I gotta respond to my son here. Just a second. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Having the courage to speak up. This is something that occurs to me about Joseph Smith and his first vision is that the adversary had such an astonishing influence over him as to bind his tongue and so on, but exerting all his powers to call upon God. So there's, again, the power of speech, the power of using our voice, because anytime that we're, facing down the entire hosts of the adversary, it's a very daunting thing. And yet, just speaking up for what's right is what gives us a license to hold on to what is true, because we're actually sticking up for it. And that's something that we can carry with us into eternity. And I just love that. So, anyways, I think there's a lot of good sense in pursuing that with all our hearts. That's something we should definitely be doing. Um, anyways, I was here's a topic that I've been studying for a couple of years, I guess, is the cause of wars. Why did people what causes wars? How are people gullible enough, basically, to go and fight each other? Kind of related to the question of why did people follow Lucifer in premortality? And yeah, it's been genuinely mind-boggling to me, because I'm like, I just can't fathom why would people follow the adversary. And to your point, yeah, I think there is something that he offers them, in a sense. And I would submit that they are deceived, but it's by yielding to temptation, we consent to be deceived. We consent to abandon our grasp of truth, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard to carry on a rational conversation with somebody who is already hooked on sin, and not willing to give it up. That's the most difficult conversation to have in all eternity, because you recognize there's just this intense pull that they don't want to believe it, right? So it's one of the primary causes of unbelief. It calls to mind the verse in John 3:19. So this is the condemnation of man, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. Right. So if we've committed sin and we haven't repented, then we hate light. We don't want to tolerate it. Right. So that's one of the reasons why people reject truth. But
Yeah,
yes, we
it,
can go.
it is. Now, there's a lot with it, but it does say in there that men love darkness more than light. And I believe very strongly that if we really start to evaluate our desires, we find out that our desires dictate even the logic that flows through our mind. And so,
Yep.
to your point, we'll believe certain things and they won't necessarily be true. But it stems from our desires, and our desires are something that we have control over. There are certain things that are just there naturally, but we can still choose to educate those desires, bridle those passions. But we can also pray for desires that are righteous or proper, and God will plant those desires in us. Then it's up to us to grow them, to strengthen them. But our desires shape our destiny. They're the things we love. Where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. If we treasure things of darkness, our heart will be there. And if we treasure things of light, our heart will be there. Um, and we have to be very careful to really search inwardly about what our desires tell us about ourselves. And it's been fascinating for me to go and explore myself and say, if I'm honest, do I want everything that I'm asked to do? Do I have a desire to do it? And so, for example, with journal writing, we're asked to keep a journal, and I do not have a strong desire to write in a journal. And I'll have to look at that and go, why do I never get to journal writing? I haven't cultivated that desire yet, and I need to do that. But that's something we can look at with the gospel, with all types of things. And it's fascinating to me to watch when people walk away from the church or gospel. It appears often that there's something they've started to desire to be a part of or participate with that's in conflict to the church. And that, to your point, leads to sin. We start to partake of the dark things because we desire it. And then our whole logic changes, our whole view on everything changes because those flow from our desires. Um, and one of the reasons I think that people struggle understanding why other people don't listen to them or aren't following them is because they're starting from two totally different starting points. And they have very different foundations of desires. And that leads to very different logical conclusions and logical pathways and all types of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's our desires, and that's something that God has made us aware of, that He's going to judge us by at the day of judgment, is by our works. and by our desires. And so you're right, like we absolutely have a need to cultivate our desires. And I think that's probably the first brick wall I run into whenever I talk to people about freedom and our responsibilities with respect to it, is that I have found this for myself. Obviously, it's something that requires great effort to cultivate the desire for freedom, the desire to achieve peace through understanding, and find out what is my duty and actually go do it. That's something that you know they say you go where you look, but also like with missionary work, there's we we only catch the spirit of the work that we actually do, and if we don't do the work, we'll never catch the spirit of it.
Yeah.
Um, Here's a quick. I'm trying to share my screen here. Hopefully this works. But quick example of sorry, just the first question in my battery of questions, I guess, that I've prepared for you here. So here's this post. If you're just listening, it's from Nayib Bukele. He's the president of El Salvador, and he's quoting this Babylon Bee article that says Sauron appointed judge rules Frodo must return ring to Sauron. And of course, this is a reference to these so-called activist judges who've been speaking up against some executive actions and other things that Donald Trump has done. And Nayib, president of El Salvador, says about this, he says, that's exactly what judges were doing in El Salvador in 2021. So we impeached them all and then proceeded to fix the country. So what's your read on this situation, and what would you? We mentioned a little bit of this kind of topic earlier. So what's what's concerning to you about here, and what do you see as your comments?
Yeah, I think it goes to the heart of what the judiciary is supposed to be. And the judiciary is supposed to be, to some extent, it's not, I don't think it was intended to be fully what it is today, but it was intended to be independent to a large extent of the political processes, the political um, fervor that would sweep through the country at different times. The founders were well aware that politics ebbed and flowed, that people's opinions ebbed and flowed, that all kinds of things changed quickly. And they debated this openly and wanted to have something that created what was supposed to be a rule of law. And the judges were supposed to help in America to have there be this notion that America is actually a country ruled by law. If you don't have a king, which means you don't have a particular person ruling, then your other option that the founders saw was to have the rule of law. To have the rule of law, you had to have some level of humans somewhere that say, this is the law, we just enforce it as it is. And so what starts happening is when the judges come out and stop something the legislature or the president or the executive, governor, whoever is trying to do, those individuals naturally can get upset by it and frustrated. But for a long time in America, and this hasn't been the case always, there's instances throughout American history where this was not always the case. Um, but the but for the most part, when the judges would issue rulings, it was viewed as what the law was. And again, we can all point to things we don't like the judges have done. But by far the sheer majority of law, most people don't even talk about because it's just generally accepted that, yep, that's the law. It was correctly ruled, that type of thing. And so if we're in a place where we just impeach judges for their decisions, then it means that we have brought the judiciary under complete control of the political process, which destroys the whole purpose of the judiciary. It essentially breaks down the rule of law and starts to create the rule of a monarch or a oligarchy or something, a body of people, whoever that is that's calling the shots on these things. And so the judiciary had fought for a long time. They were very opposed to this notion of, activism in the sense of activism from the legislature or the executive branch saying you're bad because you made a decision we disagree with. But it's really picking up a lot of steam because Trump often claims that the judiciary just doesn't like him and they're on this witch hunt against him and all these different things. But he'll say that whether or not they upheld the law or whether they didn't. So as an example, Trump on day one, when he came in the second time, issued an executive order saying to end birthright citizenship. And the news articles I could find, they would go and try and find an attorney that felt there was a constitutional basis for an executive order to end birthright citizenship over what the 14th Amendment says. And I looked at the 14th Amendment. I said, 14th Amendment is crazy express and very clear that if you're born in America, you have citizenship. Now, I'm not saying whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, just to say that's what the law says. And Trump trying to change that, whether you support or oppose the policy, it's not following the correct legal processes. It's not following any of that. And it's saying, I want to be the monarch essentially that dictates what the rules are. That's not how this country was formed. And so when judges strike it down, strike it down, strike it down, it adds to his course that look at all these judges, they're just stopping me from doing my thing. And they're all activists. We need to impeach them all. And I'm sure that the goal would be then to fill the judiciary with yes men or a woman that would just do whatever he says. Say, yep, rubber stamp, rubber stamp, rubber stamp. And we saw that happen during FDR's time. The Supreme Court of the United States pushed back on the federal government's attempt to create agencies. And they were working hard to create agencies. And the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional the first two times. And eventually, FDR got super upset and he riled up the American people to get upset about it. He sent them a letter that said, if you don't, find this next one constitutional, our third one here, I'm going to pack the Supreme Court. I'm going to appoint an additional 6 justices and it will make things go my way all the time. They'll be my yes men type thing. And the Supreme Court looked at things and they changed. And their decision the third time came and said, agencies are constitutional. We'll allow them.
Wow.
And now we have one of the greatest infringements on our constitutional rights come from agencies in America. They weren't part of the original design of things. They house a judicial branch, a legislative branch, and an executive branch all in one body. There's no check and balance or division of powers between them. And they've gone pretty crazy. Trump's also upset at them, I think, for a little bit different reasons. But these agencies became a huge issue. And there's over 2,000 agencies in the federal government with all kinds of powers, all kinds of circumventions of the Constitution. And it came from a president coming down hard and seeking to take control of the judiciary at the time. And I think we'll see repercussions that will be much worse if this type of thing continues currently.
Wow, that's terrifying. I mean, we're talking about the war on agency, and there's this proliferation of so-called agencies from the federal government. I mean, how can they do that without infringing on our agency? Because it's not pursuant to an enumerated power for any of them. They're not actually performing the duties outlined in the Constitution. So, yeah, they're coming after us big time. And I've noticed this with among other things, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, for example. They have their own means of collecting amercements, fines, and so on.
Yeah.
And their own policies, their own adjudication procedures, and wow, just crazy. Family courts too. I'm just sharing the screen for a second here because I made a meme out of out of President Trump's executive order on the 14th Amendment. So this is a parody of the last few days of Joe Biden being in office. He put this thing out on X, Twitter, wherever, with this same color scheme. President Biden declares that the Equal Rights Amendment is now the law of the land, 28th Amendment, and he was ridiculed for that, and rightly so, because presidents just can't just issue a constitutional amendment. Anyway, there were some very clear violations of his enumerated powers there. But Trump was doing effectively the same thing by attempting to modify the meaning of the 14th Amendment, and that was something that was very concerning.
Yeah.
There's
And also just if you look at this is fascinating because the route they were taking, they were trying to claim that these people were not within U.S. jurisdiction because the 14th Amendment ties it to U.S. jurisdiction. But there's actually a very dangerous precedent if that were to actually become the law, that if you were born here and your parents weren't citizens, that you were not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. It would mean that the U.S. can enforce its laws against you. The U.S. can only enforce its laws against those it has jurisdiction over. Um, so
Yeah.
really unique. I don't know. I just thought it was very short-sighted, but also very politically charged too.
Well,
I get that.
so um, I did a video on that executive order, and I tried to analyze it. My issue with it is that he specifically contradicts the statement in the 14th Amendment that says, not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, right? Well, he contradicts the jurisdictional clause in the Constitution proper in Article 3 um, by saying that children of non citizens shall not be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, Donald Trump, he's really big on the human trafficking issue, child trafficking for exploitation, whatever. And my issue here is that this explicitly creates a jurisdictional gap for the children of non citizens to fall through.
Yep.
And what have the prophets been warning us about? Don't separate parents from their children. But this would seem to explicitly justify separating children from.
Yeah, no, there's a whole host of issues that come if we start to create this class of people that aren't subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. And in some ways, it's interesting. It's what the sovereign citizens try and do. They say they're not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. So then that also creates an interesting thing of whether the child of a sovereign citizen would be a U.S. citizen based on their own precedent that they're trying to create. But again, it's more to say the 14th Amendment's pretty express, and for all of recorded history, if you're within the territorial bounds of a country, you're subject to its jurisdiction. I can't go to France and pretend like they don't have authority over me there. It's very geographically based. And these are things that it's just been interpreted that way consistently for a long time. So again, the point of this was to say when Trump passed the executive order, it was to me patently unconstitutional. And if I were a judge, I would have struck it down as well, said, no, this doesn't work. It flies in the face of the Constitution. But those judges are being labeled as activist judges because they're not towing the line and following Trump's agenda, which again is saying we're going to attack the courts now for not jumping on the political bandwagon when their job is to follow the law, not the political side of things.
Right. Yeah. And in the Federalist Papers and in just the structure of the Constitution, it's made very, very clear that the judiciary is actually supposed to be the weakest of the three branches, um, because this is from the Federalist Papers, saying that they cannot enter any active resolution. They can't, proactively cause anything to be so. They have no force or will. The legislature is what creates the will of the nation, as it were, with respect to laws, and the executive is what enforces those laws. The legislature can't have either of those, and so to guard against just being trammeled by the other branches, they say, well, let's go ahead and give them tenure for life. The judicial appointments will be for life, and that kind of gives a long-term momentum, stability, and that is actually a very good thing in this respect because no, you don't want your entire government to be whole bunch of yes men activists, really, really activists. Reverse activism is still its own form of activism. Um,
Yeah.
here's just a quote from one of this is Federalist number 47. Just happens to align with the number of our president, and this is right towards the beginning. It says this is James Madison saying. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. That is to say, if you have any effectively monolithic governing body that usurps the power over all three branches of government, then you have by definition a tyranny. And so this is precisely what Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, recommended to Donald Trump. Elon Musk retweeted that, saying, "Good idea," you know, kind of stuff. Like he's urging Trump to go and act on this, and Trump's shown some indications that he likely will, because he keeps the rhetoric going. He keeps that social media mill going of just grinding this axe against these activist judges, and so that's very concerning because, to your point, you're right. Like a judge can make some incorrect judgments or whatever, and that's not something to axe them over necessarily, uh, because if I were appointed to be a lifelong judge and somebody's like, "Hey, you made a misjudgment way back here in like 1983 or something," I'd be like, "Sorry," you know, I'd want to improve my judgment over time, and if somebody could prove that it was an incorrect judgment, but that's the thing is, um, and what they're pushing back here again, what they're pushing back against here is something that I've had some experience with and faced the wrath of myself. Um, and anyway, I'll just summarize it maybe this way, and maybe we can get into some particulars. Is that what Trump is supposedly combating here is judicial overreach. Problem is he's threatening to use executive overreach as the response. But then if you have these vines that are, climbing together and then they're intertwined, they're both overreaching, they're both kind of embracing each other, and then they become this bundle of sticks that are completely consolidated, and that's the definition of tyranny. So you can't have that. Um, right over here, this is oh yeah, this is from Federalist Number 78. I think the judiciary has no influence over the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or the wealth of society, and can take no active resolution, whatever. Neither force nor will, but merely judgment. And this is my issue. This is my issue with the judiciary here, is because um, let's let's have a fair dialogue here and say, there has been judicial overreach. In fact, we can identify the types of judicial overreach that are happening. And categorically, anytime a judge tries to enter some kind of proactive force, proactive will on the people, then they're overstepping the bounds of the judiciary. And this is what gave Roe v. Wade its teeth, is the fact that there's this doctrine of binding precedent, that basically all of the courts are required to march in lockstep with the decrees of the Supreme Court. That is the phenomenon that has created this active binding will that is enforced, right? And so, were it not for that, the judiciary ruling in Roe v. Wade, even if they made a wrong judgment, it should extend no further than the parties to the controversy. They couldn't go and tell the state courts, "You're not allowed to rule differently than us," and bind the state legislatures and so on, saying you're not allowed to have laws that ban abortion. But you see, that's the problem. I would say that's one of the biggest poison pills in the judiciary, and so that's a real problem. And there's a proper remedy for that. I think part of the frustration of people is they see something wrong, and because we were never taught in our government schools how to deal with corruption, how to deal with overreach properly, we just look to whoever's in power, who's got the biggest megaphone, who wields the biggest club, which is usually the president, and we just say, "Well, you go do something about it," because we have no idea. We've never been trained in this kind of thing, right? Um, so I would submit that defusing this incorrect doctrine of binding judicial precedent, which is primarily responsible for an awful lot of harm, to the tune of who knows how many. It's at least 64 million abortions since Roe v. Wade that have been documented. Could easily be rivaling, the death toll from communism over the last century of 100 million, right? Based on, however conservative those reports might be. And so we could look at that and say, okay, all right, we know we're being trammeled by the judiciary. We know there's judicial overreach. Why don't we just identify the problem and solve that problem? And that way, would Trump really have any legitimate grievance here? But because there is some legitimacy to the grievance that judges do overreach, they use it as an excuse to escalate the consolidation of power. That's the trajectory I've been seeing. And I would submit that the solution to that is end binding precedent and restore the jury, which has the power of nullification, right? Because if you have juries, then you have judicial review actually taking place with a decent amount of reliability. And if you don't, then you don't. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a lot of truth to it, but I don't think it fully solves the problem still. Because I'll just give some examples. So I agree that the precedent, the fact that we follow precedent causes a lot of issues with the abortion side of things. Um, but if you think about, let's say that there's a decree that New York, California says, we're going to come take all your guns. And you're a business owner or you're an individual, whatever, you've got guns. And, but let's just say you have no idea how to file a case. You have no idea how to wade through the court procedures, the court rules. You don't have the money to pay an attorney. And when the police show up, they take your guns. And if our if it were solely that you had to be a party to the case and you had to sue and join in to enforce your constitutional rights, and if you didn't, they could still enforce it against everyone that didn't. Um, it makes it so there has to be millions of cases filed every year, and I think there's still an issue that there's this notion of due process in the Constitution, which has led to part of the binding precedent side of things that says there has to be some level of predictability to America, that you can't just come and force a law, haphazardly where it applies to you, it doesn't apply to you. It starts to violate due process. So there is this notion the courts have struggled with it for quite some time, and they're actually still the things you're talking about. They're openly discussing. The courts openly discuss whether they should enter or have the power to enter a nationwide injunction, and they've been pulling back on that, saying no, we shouldn't be able to enter a nationwide injunction, meaning stopping the federal government from enforcing a law. It should only apply to the parties in the case, but the federal government still enforces it against everybody else. But I look at that still and I say, okay, you look at something like the Corporate Transparency Act. Well, if you were lucky enough to know about it in time to file a case and have it get through to be heard before you have to report, and the judge ruled it unconstitutional, then you might be okay. But if you didn't, if you weren't aware of things, which is very common because there's just thousands of laws and all these things passed all the time, what do you do at that point? And I think that I do think there needs to be some level of balance where parties can go to court. And, this is one of the things that Utah's actually, they have some bills proposed on this right now in the Utah legislature. They want to restrict a group's ability to file for people in their group. They want each individual to go to court on their own. But with how expensive courts are, with how removed they become from people's ability to access them and follow the court rules, it makes it so that people don't have relief. And so I do think that as part of this, if we're going to restore a lot of things to the judiciary and have it be much more people focused, we need to have way better access to the courts. We need to make it so that individuals can access it without these, needing to pay attorneys hundreds of dollars an hour to go to court for them.
Yeah, I've just pulled up the bill you're referring to, the judicial standing amendments proposed by Senator Brady Brammer in the state of Utah, SB 203. We've been tracking this and talking about it. Yeah, it does severely limit the ability of citizens to, sue civilly and to get relief from unconstitutional laws. Um, I think in many ways, though, like it seems to me that the question of standing, first of all, I don't see any constitutional basis for standing to say that you're not allowed to stick up for someone else's rights. Because a government, just in general, governments having force, having weapons could corner people in these alleged criminal prosecutions, and as long as they can, basically isolate them to the point where the defendants don't know their rights, where they don't know due process and stuff, then they could do whatever they want to them, and no one else really can speak up for them. And that's a huge problem that we've seen through the plea bargaining system, because they don't have a public trial at all. in those cases. Instead, it's just a private arraignment hearing where they supposedly waive their rights away. But also, in this case, let me just try to weave this in with the judicial precedent thing. Um, I would submit that if you are the accused in a case and you appeal the verdict, let's say there's a guilty verdict against you, and you appeal that up, um, the binding precedent, it's spoken of in the literature as a doctrine, and some will say it's kind of binding, kind of not, but ultimately it's just an opinion, right? The judge is if the judge decides that I want to go with the precedent, then the judge is outsourcing judgment, and that is in itself a judgment. And so that's one of the issues I take with the presupposition that precedent ought to be binding. But also, so it's been argued that the appeal structure is kind of what creates binding precedent, because if you appeal something up to the Supreme Court, then and they rule a certain way, then that'll basically homogenize. That'll kind of, in a way, force conformity of the decisions of the lower courts to those of the higher courts. And that's my take on that, is that it's partly true but mostly false. It only works in one way. That is to say, it would only be adjudicated the way the higher courts would if it actually reaches the higher court. In other words, if you have an appeal, then it reaches the higher court, and the higher court gets to make their decision on it, on all the matters of law. All the matters of fact should have been tried by a jury, right? And they can't re-examine those. But so that's my take on that situation. Is actually our judicial structure is biased in favor of leniency, and it's always like it's open season to say, if you're a judge in a lower court, you are always free to rule more favorably, more justly, more wisely, and more leniently than the higher courts. And of course, there's pressure on judges to rule justly, but I think a lot of this problem really would go away if we actually just returned to the constitutional standard of a jury is the only body that's authorized to form a criminal conviction, right? And so that way, judges are out of the picture completely when it comes to criminal convictions. They're not allowed to do that. The common phrase, the judge, jury, and executioner, right? Well, we already have at least two of those in one body every single time we have a bench trial. And the reason I'm bringing that up with respect to this right here is this is talking about like civil litigation, which is I think the route people have gone anymore, because the institution of jury trial has been erased so badly and jury nullification is just lacking. Then the people have resorted to civil suits to try to get resolution to their challenges with laws on constitutional grounds and so on. And my personal opinion is I don't think that's right. I don't think we should be going the civil route. I think we should just, let the government, write whatever laws they think are proper and just. And anytime we're at the knife's edge, where the government's trying to enforce something and trying to get something out of us, then we have a jury hear the case, and then the jury makes the decision. And they can nullify the law itself if they want to. And that would preserve our local autonomy against overreach. No one could, prosecute you for upholding an abortion ban, for example. Anyways,
Yeah, and again, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of good thought in that, but I still think from a practical standpoint, it basically becomes tyranny at that point, because most of us do not have the emotional fortitude. And again, this is maybe saying we don't have, what it takes to have liberty even, but currently if we just went to that and said, oh, so the government passed the Corporate Transparency Act, they want your info. You can't sue and ask a court to declare it unconstitutional before the government comes. You have to wait for the government to come, take you to jail, arrest you, impose fines on you, start to collect stuff, and then you get a jury at that point. We're talking 32 million business owners that now have 32 million trials across the nation. They have to go to trial, they have to do all these things. And I do ask myself the question of, do we have to wait until we go to jail? Do we have to be arrested first? Do we have to be picked up? Do we have to be charged? Because the other issue is, and this is a common thing as an attorney, is people say, well, what's going to happen? If I take this all the way to trial, what's going to happen? We say, well, this is what, the law says, what the precedent says, but ultimately it's up to what the judge decides or what the jury decides. And very few people are comfortable putting their fate in the hands of a jury, because, and again, this goes back to the beginning of this discussion that we're doing here, is that most people don't know. And so one of the things about a jury trial protecting constitutional rights, one of the assumptions under that is that the people in the jury understand their constitutional rights and understand what the Constitution is and want to uphold it. And this is a fascinating issue, kind of conundrum that we're in currently in America, is that the one of the checks that existed, one of the most important checks and balances in the Constitution, was the oath of office. When people took an oath in the 1800s, it meant something. It bound them to something. There was an actual check associated with an oath of office. Today, the oath means almost nothing to anyone. It's just a formality. It's no longer a check and balance. And the education, the understanding of liberty, the appreciation of liberty, all these different things, it's been largely lost from the American heart and mind. And so yes, at the time of the founders, the jury was an amazing thing. And again, I'm not saying that the jury is not important. Don't take it that. I'm just saying that most of the cases, if you go in front of people, they're going to convict you for not following the Corporate Transparency Act, and they won't have the education or background or whatnot to deal with that. And again, part of that's because we as a people have outsourced this to judges. But I do believe before we can restore this constitutional balance, we can't just jump back to this place and hope it works. We have to go through and have an honest discussion about how do we get the principles of liberty reinstilled in the hearts of people? How do we get the education about it reinstilled in them? It takes time to bring this check and balance back. Because again, today, even most conservative people I know, they come and ask me, they want laws that are very socialist in nature. They want laws that are very tyrannical in nature. They want the law to solve every problem. And I look at it and go, we've departed from sound principles of law and government. When you go up to the Utah legislature, they're not talking about the proper role of law when they debate a law. It's purely just, do we want it, do we not type thing. And it's wild to me to see how far we've come. But again, in restoring that balance, I do think we have to be wise about what a jury presupposes. How do we get people back to that place? And even on the civil side of things, I actually have a lot of, I do have a belief that there is value to the ability at times to get a nationwide injunction against a law that's just an aggressive overreach. Otherwise, the government can just pass aggressive laws and just enforce them against everybody that that can't make it to court, that doesn't make it to court, or whatever. Or we have tens of millions of cases filed going to trial, and it's just this massive thing where our country's become so large. And to me, there has to be some type of way to balance the rights of people, and also to have some level of due process. But the one other thing I was going to say quickly, and this is something to be aware of too, that this is actively happening. The courts in America only have power to the extent we give their opinions respect. And this is something, it was in the Federalist paper you put up, that they have to rely on the executive branch to enforce anything they say. They're just words on a piece of paper. And all the way back with Marbury versus Madison, the major Supreme Court case that set the it set the whole structure and framework for all the Constitution, or not all the Constitution, for all the Supreme Court decisions since, for the courts since. Yeah, so right here, it says that must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. So in Marbury versus Madison, Thomas Jefferson had just come into office. He was a very wild individual, had some very strong opinions, didn't really care what people said, what they didn't say. And interestingly enough, he did not help draft the Constitution. He was not here for that. He was in France. But he became the president, the third president. And second president, right before he got put out of office, appointed some judges and said, you now have this office, you should get paid, and you should get the commission of the office. And when Jefferson came in, he said, no way, we're not going to do it. I don't like these guys. And so they sued, or at least one of them sued. So Marbury sues and says, hey, judge, court, I was validly appointed by the last president. I was supposed to be put in office and I was supposed to get paid. And the courts are looking at this and they know that by law, that's what the law was at the time, that the guy should have been paid, should have been put in office. But they also knew if they just told Jefferson what to do, that Jefferson would say, pound sand, I don't care. I'm not going to listen to you. And so they did this very fascinating political dance. And what they did is they ultimately said, yeah, based on the law itself, you were supposed to have your money and supposed to have your commission. But we're going to find this law is actually unconstitutional. And the fascinating thing about that was it was a law that George Washington signed. It was passed in 1789 to set up the courts. And they struck down a law. So the Constitution was there in 1787, took till 1789, I think, to be fully ratified. First Congress then passes this law to say we're going to set up the judiciary in accordance with the Constitution. And the Supreme Court comes back and says, that act was unconstitutional. They exceeded the bounds of it. And so we can't give you your commission, even though the law said you're supposed to have it. It was unconstitutional, so you can't do it. And what they did at that time is they made it so Jefferson loved the decision. He goes, aha, I don't have to do it, see. And they convinced America at that time to listen to them. And since that time, the Supreme Court has tried very hard to be viewed as the most intelligent and wise body on legal matters. Justice Roberts in I believe it was the gay marriage decision, he said that, he essentially said the power of the courts rests solely in the respect accorded to its decisions. And one of the things that's happening in America right now is we're lobbying this aggressive attack on the courts saying, we don't want to respect your decision. We don't want to respect your decision. And if we lose respect for the court's decisions, the courts lose all their power, because then all the executive branches and governors can say, well, I don't care. I don't care what that is. And this is one of the reasons that precedent became such an important thing, is the courts recognized that if they were flip-flopping all over the place, or you'd get one decision here, one decision there, whatnot, there'd be no respect for their decisions. And they knew they'd lose the power that they'd gained under Marbury versus Madison. Now, I'm not saying they should have that power necessarily, but when the executive can just choose to look at the courts and say, I don't care, and say whatever you want to say, I don't care, we do lose something. And it's actually, I think, pretty big something that we lose. If you go to the prophecy of Ezra's eagles, that talks about the three-headed eagle. America is symbolized by a three-headed eagle. The three heads represent the branches of government. And in his vision, and this is an apocryphal vision, so may or may not be true, but in his vision, he sees one of these heads disappear. And then once the one head disappears, the other two heads go to war with each other. And ultimately, the one head kills the other head. And then there's just one head. And I think all these things we're talking about here, we're talking about different ways that the political movements of the day can flip to there being just one head, there being just one vine, where we lose this balance and it becomes tyrannical, essentially. And my feeling is that we need to approach these things like you talk about with the overreach with these different things with proper balances back. We need the proper check and balance back. But we have to keep them in balance and not strive to kick one out completely or eliminate it. Or else a head can gain too much power and destroy the others. And that's one of the things that the founders had set up. And again, the courts did become more powerful than intended. But it's also part of it was in response to an executive branch that became far more powerful than intended. And I don't think we can rebalance the judiciary correctly until we also rebalance the executive correctly, or else the executive will destroy the others.
Yeah, it has to be a a measured, even approach, right? Um, and to your point about Marbury versus Madison creating new executive powers, that's been one of my huge concerns, frankly, throughout time. Is that the people who've been, picking up the tab for that, it's we the people, frankly, and there is supposed to be tension among these branches. So
Yep.
here's one idea though, because in this SB 203 thing that we were just looking at with standing, where people are there's this proposal of limiting the people standing to bring suits against the government. Um, I would just submit that if we were to restore the institution of the grand jury, that's an institution that has been described in contrast to the trial jury. Trial jury has been described as a shield against the encroachments of the government. Thomas Jefferson did say he considered trial by jury as the only anchor ever yet imagined by man by which governments could be held to their written constitutions. I believe that's enormous, and that's true. So at the knife's edge, yes, you can protect against all of those attacks if you have jury nullification. But also, then the question arises: what do you do about corruption within the government? And this is where grand juries differ as to the way that they're described historically as both a sword and a shield. That is to say, the grand jury is a standing body that has investigative power. So we've been talking about Doge, in all our social media circles and in the news and stuff, about all this corruption they're exposing and stuff. And the question I get most often from people who've been following this is, how on earth can we hold our government accountable? Aha, somebody's finally doing it for us, a knight in shining armor. And I'm like, Doge is not a knight in shining armor, because they're usurping, they're not only transgressing the boundaries of the executive branch by, taking upon themselves legislative responsibilities regarding the power of the purse, but they're also usurping a power that properly belongs to the people themselves. And that is the power to investigate and try our public officers. And that is to say, a grand jury, as a standing body, if they suspected anyone of corruption, anyone of malfeasance, anyone of dereliction of their duty or anything like that, they could proactively go and investigate the guy. They would have secrecy. They would have the benefit of secrecy in their investigations and in their hearings. And then if they found sufficient evidence that somebody had done something wrong, committed a crime, then they could issue an indictment, which was typically done under a prosecutor. But they could also, of their own initiative, without anybody in the government prompting them to, they could just take it upon themselves and be like, hey, let's check out that guy. Let's see what he's up to. We think he might be corrupt. Let's go check it out, right? Or we think there's evidence of this. And they could go investigate, and then they could form a presentment, which is of its own complete autonomy and initiative, no intervention from any of the branches of government, whether executive, legislative, or judicial. And they could just say, hey, we got dirt on this guy. Let's hold a trial, right? And so that in that way, the grand jury serves as a sword, right? So you were talking about the issue of how would people be able to go and get get redress for their grievances if there was some unconstitutional law that was being enforced? Do they all have to go before the courts and have every single one adjudicated? No, actually, the people can proactively go and say, this senator is trying to pass legislation that's unconstitutional or has passed it. Let's go hold him accountable, right? Or in the case of Marbury versus Madison, what if a grand jury were to say, well, it's actually a crime to shortchange someone out of his wages or his salary, so we're going to go ahead and issue a presentment against our president. We're going to hold him accountable because this guy deserves his pay. right? And I think that would solve so much of the conundrum around civil proceedings because our own government has taken it upon itself to be able to, the power to be able to issue civil proceedings, which I don't see that power written in the Constitution anywhere. By definition, a civil proceeding belongs to the people. It's a suit between the people and the people. If the government is a plaintiff to a suit, then by definition, it's a criminal case, right? And so by muddying those boundaries, by setting the precedent, if you will, of having, used these mechanisms improperly and then forgetting the proper institutions, I think that's part of the reason why we've ended up where we've ended up. But and to your point, yes, people do need to be virtuous. They have to, actually conform to laws of morality, which is why John Adams said that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people, and it's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. But equipped with that, if we were, decent people, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be trusted under the Constitution, and it's still our legitimate right to be able to challenge our public officials. Even you mentioned the oath of office. Right? We've each taken upon ourselves an oath of citizenship to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. These are the things we were never taught in our government schools, right? And so, yeah, to your point, a lot of this is an education issue. We do need to end the federal brainwashing. That's been one of the biggest problems we've been dealing with since the beginning of the republic. Um, and frankly, that's one of the biggest things that's ending a republic. But anyways, do you have any thoughts on grand juries?
Yeah, I think the again, it's an interesting thing to throw into the mix now because what would happen? Let's just say we just opened it up and said, okay, you can start a grand jury against someone. They would quickly be weaponized, the same that Trump's weaponizing things right now to say, well, they did something I didn't agree with, or I felt it's unconstitutional. We have two very strongly divided camps in America about what is or isn't right or constitutional. And if a group of 10 people could get together and bring criminal charges against an acting senator and then get and then convict them, again, who knows what that proceeding looks like exactly? How do we make sure that, it's a fair cross section of society or whatever? Um, Government officials would be under constant attack just with the way that our world is and how we've moved to that place. And so this is still something where I look at it and I say, yeah, grand juries, I agree, were initially designed to be something like you're talking about, this check and balance on government corruption. But how do we manage that in a world that's not moral, where people will just use it to pursue their political ends, just to get out anyone that disagrees with them or whatnot? Um, and ultimately, the only check and balance on that is immoral people. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, though. When we say immoral people, a big part of that is saying people that take on the personal responsibility of their country, of liberty. And one of the ways I see liberty is that if you have anarchy on one side where there's no law, and you have tyranny on the other side where the law governs everything, or one individual can choose everything, however you want to phrase that. To me, the balance is liberty is the balance in the middle on the seesaw. And we need laws to pull us out of anarchy, but we have to have morality and personal responsibility. This is the realm where people need to do things to keep us from tyranny. And the Constitution was designed to be such that we as a people were fulfilling our personal responsibility in certain realms. So again, the oath of office worked as a serious check and balance for a long time. Grand juries were helpful for a very long time. And the prosecutors in general, there was a check and balance with the grand jury still, and that a prosecutor still had to pick it up. And these prosecutors then had to follow through with it. And so it wasn't just wide open to the people necessarily. But I do look at it and say, if we want to get back to a place where we can have more input into the government, we also as a people have to start walking the path of taking on more and more responsibility. In the Book of Mormon, there's a point where they're preaching to the Lamanites, and the Lamanites become excited to take upon themselves and answer for their own things, whether they're going to eat, whether they're not, that type of thing. It says they were excited to take on their own responsibility. And if you look at our current society, if we get laid off from work, we all want unemployment compensation. Um, this is a social net the government's put in
We're too
place.
soft, and that's part of what the government has done to us with these social programs, and many of the people have gone on with it, along with it. But
But we also, there's many of us that have willingly said, "Oh, I like that."
yeah, and there are many of us who have been like, whoa, 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 stop! Like, I've always been in favor of unplugging the inflation monster and ending Social Security because it's just socialism, and they steal the vast majority of the value of it over the term of the so-called investment anyway.
Yeah, and
Um,
talking about grand juries, that'd be a great place to start with a grand jury is theft from the Social Security.
well, yeah, yeah, and that should be investigated. But ultimately, like what I'm talking about with the powers of the grand jury, and yes, people need to be moral, but and this is something I was reading actually in William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. He describes the institution of the grand jury, and to your point, yeah, we lack a lot of education on this subject because we the people have frankly not been involved in our government. There's still a thing. There's still constitutional. We still have a right and a responsibility, frankly, to participate in grand juries. And I think it's true that you don't want to just pick random yahoos off the street today and have them participate, but there does need to be a fair process where the people vet themselves. Maybe something like a caucus convention, say, hey, I nominate you because you're, I don't know, maybe I'm just barking up a tree there. But the idea is that the grand jury and the trial jury are both self-vetting institutions. That our government would shortchange our right to access those and exercise those institutions if they were to try to proactively gatekeep them and say, hey, no, you people, you're not allowed to have a grand jury. You're not allowed to investigate us. You're not allowed to indict us. You're not allowed to try us by jury. If we get to that point, which we surely have in many respects, because that's not recognized by a lot of public officials, that's a dereliction of their duty, by the way, and they can be held accountable by a grand jury. That's in the Constitution, and in fact, it says that no criminal the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. So, like, anytime there's a serious crime that somebody is alleged to have committed, it has to be a grand jury that issues that indictment or that presentment. And so it's an institution that we should still exercise today. And obviously, like they've muddied it with the family courts and stuff, like saying, "Oh, you've done some bad thing, and we're going to take your family away. You're going to take your kids away, and stuff." It's like, well, wait a minute, hold on, what law did I break, right? And if I broke a law, then it's a criminal case. If it's a criminal case, I get a trial jury. And there has to be actually also a grand jury who presents that. And the people have to be able to vet the grand juries. And that's one of the things I keep resorting to with this principle of voir dire, the legal procedure for juries to vet themselves, not for the government to put its thumb on the scale and say, this is what we think an unbiased juror looks like, because then it's got government bias all over it.
The
There's a
one
really
thing
great.
just to throw out real quick too, though,
Yeah.
with that, in the Constitution, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh Amendments, talking about juries, grand juries, all that kind of stuff. Those were restrictions at the beginning solely for the federal government, so states could still do whatever they wanted in that respect. So state criminal laws were not subject to those constitutional provisions. The 14th Amendment did come along, and the 14th Amendment had some text that's, could be argued. Some argue one way, some argue another way, to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. And the Supreme Court went through looking at that. And again, it wasn't a model of clarity in the 14th Amendment. And they applied some of those to the states and some of them not to the states. So the grand jury requirement, they opted not to apply to the states. Now, again, I'm not here saying that's right or wrong necessarily. Just when the Constitution was first made, states did not have to use a grand jury. For criminal cases, states had states had laws against killing or whatever that they could validly enforce under the states' rights part of the Constitution, but they weren't subject to the grand jury side. So there was, from the beginning, there was some level of, we're going to let each state kind of figure it out as they go too. And so there is this interesting still question to always keep in mind of, well, does a state have more ability to not do these things, or should they be held to the full Bill of Rights? And for the most part, the states have been held to the Bill of Rights under the 14th Amendment, but they have not, it's not been fully incorporated against them. And the grand jury is one of those that was not. So just a random thing to throw out, I guess.
Well, I would submit that that's something like so. I've we didn't have this conversation earlier about the 14th Amendment, but this is one of the things that I address in my video on the topic with Trump's executive order is the fact that the subject to the jurisdiction thereof clause is, I believe, a poison pill for the following reason that under the so-called originalist interpretation of that, it's taken to mean something other than the jurisdictional clause and statement from the judiciary section of the Constitution, Article 3. And the reason why they say that is so that they can construe it because they say the authors did not intend for this to grant citizenship based on where people were born, but rather the law was still citizenship based on inheritance, who you were born to. And frankly, the issue is that that created two different definitions of the phrase subject to the jurisdiction, which lawyers and judges could then look at and just arbitrarily choose which interpretation they want to uphold. So one of the huge problems with the vast corpora of case law, so-called, and all these precedents, these judgments, and so on, is that they will just sample. And this is one of the things with law generally, is that law is selectively enforced in our nation today and in many nations. It is selectively enforced. And the reason for that is very obvious. It's the people in power want to be able to do whatever they want, and they want to be able to go after whoever they want on any pretense. Dinesh D'Souza is a great example of this. He's somebody who is selectively prosecuted. There's this law that they never enforce, never punish, and then maybe not never, but like his case was cruel and unusual, if you will. It was a very outlandish case, and I think it's very important that we understand that when we look at constitutional arguments with these amendments. Part of the reason for redundant wording in these amendments, people then argue from ignorance about the subject to jurisdiction clause, saying it must mean something other than that because it can't possibly mean that because that would be redundant, right? That's one of my issues with the Equal Rights Amendment, by the way. It's because the text of that is largely it's largely redundant. But then you have this issue of, well, then what could it mean, right? Then, oh, that's right. Hey, judges, go invent a meaning for it, right? Under your vast powers of interpretation. And so that's one of the things I take issue with there. And I would say that something similar has happened with the incorporation clause because, frankly, I mean, if you look at Brigham Young's statements, and I know a lot of people don't think he's an authoritative person on the subject, but he actually said something to the effect of that the free and independent states idea has been taken too far because I think the Supreme Court actually did find similar to this. I'm trying to remember if it was Aaron B. Cooper. Don't quote me on that, but they have found that if you have a right that is guaranteed to you at the federal level, the states aren't authorized to deny it, and that would attach to jury trials and so on. It's not a matter of someone going through the Bill of Rights with a fine-tooth comb and saying, "Oh yeah, that one you get, that one you don't get." Right? States aren't entitled to deny you your rights. People can, bequeath certain powers to the states in addition to the federal government, but anything that the federal government is supposed to secure and protect, the states can't trammel. And this is one of the reasons why the Dobbs decision was so. It wasn't the win that a lot of people thought it was, frankly, because it's kicking the can down to the states. And what that says, the precedent that creates, is that the federal government is specifically disclaiming its responsibility to protect the rights of the unborn. When in fact, those are persons, those are human beings. They have rights. They have human rights, right? And so the federal government can't just abdicate that responsibility. They're actually responsible. They're on the hook to protect those people's lives. And it's the same with states' rights, frankly. I'm sorry, with the human rights, the rights of the people within the states is that they can't just say, oh, well, we're going to nullify this federal protection and then punish you with death and not have a jury trial. The states can't properly do that.
I think disagree on that. So just to be, upfront, that when the Constitution was created, many of the states were not willing to agree to be bound by all of the Bill of Rights. And it was very express that Congress shall make no law. If you look at things like the First Amendment, they were very express on who they were limiting the power to. And the states still had widespread power to pass laws on religion or on speech or on different things like that. And so from the beginning, the states certainly viewed it as they weren't bound by the same provisions that were in the Bill of Rights, of those rights retained by the people. Those were there to be a check on the federal government. And there was this state experiment of we're going to let different things happen. And I think from history, from looking at how the states responded very quickly to these things, they never viewed themselves as being bound by the First Amendment or the Bill of Rights. States that liked certain concepts put them into their state constitutions, for sure. But those had to be carried over into the state constitutions, and the grand jury was not carried over into all state constitutions. And again, from the beginning, not all states followed the grand jury model. And so from a historical perspective, I think that while some people would say, yeah, the states don't have the right to violate a right that the government can't, but again, the text of the amendments were pretty expressive. Congress shall make no law. It didn't say the states shall make no law. And the Constitution was always viewed as a restriction on federal power, not on state power necessarily, which is, to me, still part of this fascinating tension, like you talk about the tension we had that existed. And if you look at things that Dallin H. Oakes has said about the 14th Amendment, I believe from his statements on it, he's been very strong that the 14th Amendment, he calls it the most inspired constitutional amendment. And he says it was very necessary to impose the Bill of Rights on the states to the 14th Amendment to fully protect rights. And so these are pieces, again, that maybe some of them intended for it, I don't know. But from a practical and quickly unfolding standpoint in American history, the states viewed themselves as not being bound by the First Amendment or by the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, and this is kind of where we get into judicial interpretation again, and kind of just what people's opinions were, what precedent was, what we assume that their views were, and so on. And frankly, what I've seen is a lot of that is just arguing from ignorance. And I've seen that on both sides, especially today, where a lot of the history is obscure, it's long forgotten. You know, if we had the founding fathers right here, it'd be relatively easy to just ask their opinion, and we might get some differing opinions on some of these things. But it is interesting, for example, that the Bill of Rights was added by the Anti-Federalists as a bid to say, well, let's make sure that we don't trample rights because we want to at least identify these ones and make sure that the Constitution isn't seen as just some omnipotent document. And one of the arguments against that was, well, we also want to make sure that people don't see the Bill of Rights as a limited list because it's infinite, right? And so the idea that people could assume that it's not actually it doesn't inherit to the states. To me, that's just wild and kind of very overtly contradicted by the Ninth and 10th Amendments. But at the same time, yeah, you could see what are people interpreting this as, and I would submit to the common law, which the founding fathers have submitted. Those are the rules of common law, the rules of common sense, if you will. That is the people are to exercise their conscience, and if you don't have conscience, if you don't have a jury in every criminal case, then you don't have the right to, I don't have the recognized right anyway to exercise your conscience in the matter. And I think that is a very fundamental matter of human rights, is to have due process, have the have the right to an impartial jury of your peers and so on. But in any case, I can see we've really gone very far away from active participation in government, which is one of the reasons why we find these questions so challenging. Let me just reorient myself here a little bit. Let's go on to this question I had for you: the public and private sector divide. This is something that I know you've been very, very passionate about, and can you just kind of give some general principles and help us to understand that particular problem and how it affects us?
Yeah, so we have, the public sector is kind of in general, and there's obviously exceptions, whatever, so don't take issue with just this general statement. But public side is generally talking about the government, laws, cities, states, federal government, whatnot. The private side, when we talk about public-private partnerships, we're often talking about businesses and more realistically talking about money. private is kind of another name for money right here. And so we start to get these partnerships in the government where the government partners up with money, privately controlled money, meaning it's not subject to voting, it's not subject to government transparency laws, all these different things. And they go do something together. And so you start to just think from the get-go of like, oh, so if there's a really, if think of your worst enemy that's a billionaire. Think of a billionaire that you're very uncomfortable with, whether that's Bill Gates, whether that's, whoever. If they can just go partner up with the government and start to do things where they have the force of law and they get to make a lot of money off of the situation, there's a lot that can start to happen. And this is interesting because the public-private partnership side has arisen where our government more and more says, I need to become more efficient, I need to spend less money, so I'm going to go let a private party do this. So, for example, we have companies now that build prisons and maintain prisons, and they get paid per prisoner that's in the prison. And so when you look at American criminal laws, you start to say, oh, so a company, if they want to make more money, how do they do it? They got to get more people in prison. So we start to look at a number of these things about the weakening of the judiciary, the weakening of the jury, the plea deals, all this type of stuff. Well, we literally have corporations across America making money when people are in prison. And you start to go, whoa, 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 that's now creating a perverse incentive. We're not talking about justice anymore. And when you start marrying money and law together, and people can start to make money through force, it starts to get really ugly. And we actually see this in many ways. We see it in warfare, where every time there's a war and we're shooting off these missiles that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a piece or whatever it is, someone's making a crazy amount of money off of war. And then you start to go, so why are we at war? Well, someone's making a lot of money. And if war is profitable, does that tend to create some very concerning conflicts? But even on a less, I'd say a less insidious side of things, we see this happening. So let's just look at cars, for example. What happens with when money and law are married is that we have these laws, and these actually are an extension of the common law, interestingly enough. But we have this thing about duty, where I have a duty to not harm someone. And we have this term of negligence that I'm negligent if I don't follow my duty. So the question arises as to when analog brakes became a thing, for example. Someone invented the analog brake system, and it could keep people alive better than a normal brake system. At some point, these car manufacturers would be sued and held liable for being negligent for not putting analog brake systems in their cars, even though they were more expensive. And what the American tort law has done, which again is tort law is almost all based on common law. The American tort law has married this notion that if I'm an entrepreneur and I go, oh, if I want to force people to buy my product, all I have to do is do something that makes things a little bit safer. And then the others are negligent for not putting it in place. And our car prices have skyrocketed. They're so expensive compared to what they used to be. But we continue to mandate new and new things. And the same thing happens with healthcare, where we say, why in the world do we pay so much for healthcare? Well, as soon as a company invests billions of dollars into some new process or procedure that makes it so you experience a little less pain, or you're in recovery for 6 hours instead of 8 hours, well, the hospitals at some point have to buy the new machines. They have to upgrade, they have to do these new things. And as an entrepreneur, again, I know that if I just make it a little bit better, the law is going to require everyone to adopt it at some point. And there starts to become this very gross relationship between money and power, where again, if you lust for money or lust for power, you can start to use money to get power, or you can start to use power to get money. And both become very concerning. But ultimately, I think one of the reasons it's deeply concerning is because there's a Supreme Court decision from the 1930s where the federal government. So I guess this goes back a little bit. So let's go to the 16th Amendment. This sets it up. 16th Amendment says, hey, let's let the government impose income tax. There were other checks and balances stripped from the Constitution with the 16th Amendment. But we'll just focus on the income tax for a second. Prior to the 16th Amendment, the courts had said the government didn't have the power to impose an income tax under the Constitution. And so they passed the amendment to say, hey, we want to do this. And what the federal government would do then is they'd go into these states and take money from people, and then they would say, oh, we'll give it back to you. We're now holding it all. We have the money, and we'll give it back if you do what we ask you to do. And if you look at the 16th Amendment, it says without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Prior to this, they had to give out money equally to all the states based on population. And so they couldn't favor one state over another. They couldn't selectively give it to one state and not another. But the 16th Amendment said, yeah, you can take it and then just selectively give it back. So they started to say, we will only give it to you if you do what we say, but you don't have to. It's not a law. So if you don't want the money back, great. You don't have to follow this. And this was challenged in the courts. And ultimately, the Supreme Court upheld it as constitutional. This was during the court packing threats and different things. But one dissenting justice prophesied, and he said, whoa, he said, if we let this happen, he said, this will be a complete circumvention of the Constitution. He said, because there'll be no limits. He says the power of the purse will become so strong that the government will be able to effectively, the federal government will be able to effectively force every state and people to do whatever they want them to do. Because it's not required. It's just, oh, you want the money? Well, come along. You tie this then to the prophecy about the mark of the beast in the book of Revelations. And that prophecy says, John 2,000 years ago said, they were going to force you to take on the mark of the beast, not through law, not through compelling you at the pain of, death, essentially, or jail, but it was at the pain of not being able to buy or sell. They were going to use money to control you. And they were going to cut you off from the financial system if you didn't do what they said, but it'd be considered, quote, voluntary. Oh, you made the decision. You don't have to. You're not going to jail if you don't, type thing. And so when I look at the public-private partnerships and how much they're exploding right now, again, they allow for all kinds of things to happen, not subject to grandma, not subject to public records and transparency. They allow for people to start to make a lot of money off of government projects. You look at Ryan Smith with the NHL team coming to town and Salt Lake City saying, we're going to increase in our sales tax here in the city. And that increased portion, we're going to just send it directly to you. Use it to make the Delta Center better, use it to redevelop downtown. But guess what? You still get to own all that at the end. So you make all the money off this taxpayer funds. And in exchange, charge a little extra and ticket prices to go to affordable housing. And I look at that and I say, wow, so we literally just gave a billionaire a source of revenue where he's forcing it to be sent to him. You can certainly choose to some extent whether you buy things in Salt Lake City or not, but the people that live there can't choose to not buy things. If they order something online, it gets assessed to where their address is and things. And we start to see this roll forward and this mixing of money, power, where we see more and more that money buys power and that power begets money. And it's a very unhealthy relationship, very improper, and it's one that further distances the average citizen like us from our government, from the powers that be. And I don't believe for a second that the founders ever intended for money and government to be so married. They actually set up our government to be inefficient. It was supposed to be a long process to pass a law. There was supposed to be this back and forth, this tension, this kind of fighting, because they wanted laws to be something that were methodical, that were thought through, where they went through things. But instead, we're pushing to say, make the government efficient, make it operate like a business. And you go, shouldn't do that in all respects. Now, I'm not
Yeah.
opposed to the driver's license division operating efficiently. That's not what I'm talking about. But talking about government as a whole. Um, and we certainly don't need to be spending as much money or involved in as many programs. But the system itself of government needs to be inefficient. It needs to have conflicts. It needs to not operate like a business. And it can't be about making money. We have this fascinating thing where the government is starting to step into more and more the desire to make money. And again, you start to say, okay, so if we set up these sovereign wealth funds, Trump wants to set up a sovereign wealth fund. There's a bill proposed in Utah this session to set up a sovereign wealth fund. They want to put $139 million, I think, into it and then let it grow and invest it. But they're going to be investing it in whose businesses? And then are they going to want to regulate these businesses appropriately? No, there's just now this huge conflict of interest. And we have not even remotely begun to create the checks and balances necessary for government to interact with money to this extent, or for money to interact with government. We're so behind on any type of check or balance there. And my personal opinion about any power we give the government, if we're going to do it, if we feel it's a good thing, it has to come with checks and balances. You do checks and balances first, power second. You don't just give them power and then be like, oh, I hope it works out.
Here's a bunch of
Doesn't work out that
money.
way.
Don't hurt anybody.
Yep. Just go for it. I just trust you're going to do the right thing. You've got my back, right, government? Yep, I got your back. Sweet. Here it is.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why, like, what I'm most concerned about, frankly, is defendant rights of all things. Um, because, yeah, just, and including how do we defend against having our life savings inflated away, right? That's another defensive thing, if you will, that could be resolved offensively if we just had grand juries go and, issue presentments against every member of Congress who's okay with not repealing, not ending the Federal Reserve and fiat, and just return to gold or silver coin and nothing but, which is what the Constitution says is our legal tender, or nothing but that shall be. But yeah, so that's a really interesting kind of expose on public-private partnerships. I've not experienced it as much from the corporate side and from the side of but it makes a lot of sense that the government looks at and sees these businesses as an opportunity to gain more wealth, more power, and so on, basically to enrich themselves and have this partnership where they, this is basically the realm of protectionism, which is kind of what got me into reading court cases actually, because I got pulled over for um, not having my auto insurance paid up because my auto insurance app's auto pay feature failed, and next thing I know, I'm getting pulled over. Somebody ran my license plate. Hey, you aren't paid up on your insurance. I'm like, okay, tell me why I should buy insurance. Seems like a presumptive judgment to me, something that's not an enumerated power. Um, but yeah, very interesting because I think there's some other takes on public-private partnerships. One of them that's probably very familiar to a lot of people, um, maybe they just don't know that it's familiar yet, is Elon Musk's businesses and subsidies. I've actually been kind of a ruthless critic of Elon on this point because he's with his Department of Government Efficiency going and tearing down all these slush funds for Democrats and stuff, and questioning how do these Congress members get all this money on a few $100,000 a year salary, and then they've got a net worth of like 200 million or something like that. So that's a very fair question. Going after that in the swamp, absolutely. But another important question though is, and of course they're accused of money laundering through a lot of these public-private partnerships where they'll pass a law that does such and such and they'll get some kind of kickback, right? Or they'll take some funds and they'll misappropriate or whatever. And so those are kind of more clandestine things to do. Um, but it's really interesting to see as well. Just I believe there's money laundering that's going on out in the open through public-private partnerships, if you will. For example, in the form of subsidies, because there's nothing in the Constitution that actually grants our government power to take a private entity and say we're going to subsidize you. That's just overtly unconstitutional. Anyways, a lot of other things we could probably dive into there. Yeah, the 16th Amendment did away with the restriction that only a census tax could be a direct tax, only kind of direct tax. But yeah, I see that as it basically ensured that the government would grow in proportion to the people and to businesses and kind of incentivized even further digging their claws into those things. I'll probably brush past this topic pretty quickly, but I just want to point it out, I guess, another private public mongrelization, I guess, incest that's happening between government and supposedly private entities I've seen in elections. Having gone through Phil Lyman's petition to the United States Supreme Court, have you been following Spencer Cox versus Lyman?
I have.
Okay, wonderful. So you saw the petition to the Supreme Court. It's prepared by Tracy Haverson. I'm not expecting you to have read it, but it was
Yeah, no, I have seen it.
okay. It was fun to. I did a deep dive on that, and what I found was the poison pill. The Supreme Court found that this was the case. This was their excuse. Is basically if they give the parties a role in the election process, then they're basically allowed to dictate the terms of the party's elections. And members of the Republican Party in Utah are really upset about this because they're like, hey, the government just dictated to us who our candidate should be. They just dictated to us the process for choosing our candidate. We're supposed to be able to determine our own process and choose our own candidate using that process. And we just got trammeled. What gives? Well, it's because it's a private public partnership. That's what's going on with your vote, and I call
Yeah.
that vote laundering, right? And they're basically just doing a bait and switch on you.
Yeah, no,
Because
this is what I've told people as well. I've said the reason the courts have allowed them to do this to the parties is because the parties got in bed with the government before. They wanted to become in power, so they went and said, pass laws that are protectionist in nature. Don't let a viable third party form. And they let third parties appear in name, but the laws are such that they restrict them from becoming viable. And it's very much an operation of law. They use law as a sword to cut down any attempt to take over their power. And so at the end of the day, when the government says, well, you know, we've been protecting you for so long, we actually, and again, we're intertwined at this point. We're completely one and the same, essentially. We're going to regulate you now. People get upset and say, but we're a private association. And I say, no, you left that private association realm a long time ago.
yep,
You
you're on the
became a
take now.
public-private partner. Yep, you're a public-private partnership, and the government has their tentacles in you. You
Exactly.
succumbed.
Yeah, and that's so toxic. And frankly, yeah, we should have the challenge. We should have the power to challenge that everywhere that Hydra head crops up. It's just everywhere. Um, so again, one of the reasons why I'm big on grand juries and being able to be proactive, squashing these examples of government overreach instances. We just have a few minutes here. We got to wrap up next 10 minutes, but we got to go. But a few other things, and maybe we'll just. I was going to say this at the beginning. It's way too much for us to cover in a single hashing it out session. But I guess I've already mentioned my stance on defendant rights. I see the illegal immigration issue and this notion of being tough on crime, which is a very Republican notion. I've seen it talked up a ton here in our local venues and debates and meetings and stuff. Just, oh, be tough on crime, tough on crime. And I'm just like, nobody remembers the Fourth or Fifth Amendments anymore. It just seems like it's being weaponized as an excuse to erase defendant rights. So yeah, if this stuff goes through, I would just say anybody who's listening, check what your state legislature is up to because they are very likely trying to ramrod something through like Utah's SB 203, 204 right now to basically supposedly quell the judicial overreach by granting the other two branches power to control the judiciary, basically consolidating them all into one and eliminating citizen standing or drastically reducing it. You have this presumption of constitutionality thing as well that we haven't really gone into, but you have that. You cover some of that, I guess, in your reviews. But yeah, look out for that because they're doing the same thing at the federal level. They're doing it all in lockstep, states and federal, saying, "Oh, let's go and impeach the judges, impanel new ones that are all from the same party." Very similar phenomenon has the same effect anyway as the state legislation that would bind the judiciary to be the same as the legislature and the executive, all marching in lockstep. So that's very concerning because if we actually have a jury trial, that's the only thing that could stand up to that: grand juries and trial juries. I was going to give a shout out for a book, but maybe I'll do that after we've after you've dropped off and we're winding up here. So let me just focus more on kind of our common ground here and the things we want to work on together. How to end the party system. Um, so I've done some dives into this. I've been trying to get the attention of all of the delegates in the Utah Republican Party and others because this has been a huge issue both locally and abroad. But the 12th Amendment, that's what gave us the two-party system. Because with this first past the post system, you have it's plurality voting. You can only vote for one. And what that means is that you'll always be prone to the spoiler effect, and therefore you can effectively only have a two-party system under that. Basically, you can vote for a third party, but then they have this notion that well, you're just throwing away your vote if you vote independent, if you vote third party, then that's like giving your vote to Kamala Harris. So much rhetoric, so much rage could have been saved if we didn't have that one problem. And so if we were to return to the constitutional way of doing it, though, they say under the Electoral College originally, it was vote by ballot for two persons. And one with the most votes would be president, one with the second most votes would become vice president. And what are your thoughts on that from a checks and balances perspective, and just how do we slay this beast of the two-party system?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to look at it, because there are different ways to vote that radically improve a third party's chance of actually being viable. But to your point, well, if you vote for the one, it's throwing away the vote, or you're voting. If you vote for a third party, it's a vote for the person you don't like. There's certainly the 12th Amendment side to that, but there's also, I'll point out, just a fear-based perspective. If you go back to the war in heaven, part of our conversation in this is that there's two main ways to view the future. One is through a lens of faith, and one is through a lens of fear. And I believe very strongly that Satan was viewing it through a lens of fear, which was, some of us may not choose to do good, some of us may not be saved. And that fear led to a very different place. Satan uses fear to control us today. And the psyche, the mental psyche, or the mental, thought process that exists upon almost all American politics is one of fear, where we're making decisions out of fear instead of faith. And so from a very basic perspective, we can actually fight against the two-party system simply by adopting a spirit of faith and saying, I vote for the right person. I'm not responsible for what everyone else in America does, assuming I've talked and I've done my part. But at the end of the day, America does what America does. But I'm responsible to vote for the right person. And if we all just adopted that faith, our whole thing would change very quickly, which would be quite interesting. But to the point about the systems being put in place, the check and balance in the president and vice president, the founders they got rid of the original system very quickly. The founders were basically still alive when they passed the 12th Amendment because, again, Jefferson and some of these others were just so hot-headed, so difficult that they said, we can't even do our job at this point. I don't know enough of the history to know how bad it really was, or if it was more just pride-based. But I do look at it, and one thing the Constitution didn't really do, I don't think, is it didn't give the vice president enough specific powers to truly be a valid check and balance if we just went back to the pure thing. I think if we got rid of the 12th Amendment and went back to this voting system it had originally, it would need to be tied to giving the vice president some specific powers so there could be more of a articulated check and balance of what's happening. And I wouldn't mind at all of having some check and balance of you have the president and the vice president's also elected separately, and they do check and balance each other. But I do think it would require more, some more flesh around what the vice president's supposed to be doing.
That's a great point. I think that's very good input, good feedback, good ideas for how the Constitution could be amended in the future to prevent the exact kind of conundrum that we're facing today. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I just have maybe a couple of final thoughts here. Let me just ask. Got 5 minutes left, and then I will call it. But are there any other topics, any other points you just want to make? What's your closing statement? Anything you want to bring up to people, call to action, etc.?
Yeah, so one thing that I think gets lost again in all this, we talk about these huge systems, this federal government, the state governments, all these things. If you go to the heart of it though, and you say, what feeds them? What gives them life? What gives them power? That comes back to us. We are the individuals and the beings that give these things life. If you look at a company like Google or Facebook, what gives it life? It's us as a consumer. Our use of it are these different things give it life. If we want to change Facebook, pretty easy. We could all just stop using Facebook and they would instantly change to whatever we want because that lifeblood has been cut off. Everything in mortality has for lack of a better word, a circulatory system. It's getting its life from somewhere. And we're still at a place in our country where our government gets its life from us. And this is why we have the ability still to do something. There's prophecies about the Constitution hanging by a thread or whatnot. Um, but whether you believe those or you don't, you can still look at it and say, but I'm not in jail yet. I'm still talking. And as long as I can still use my voice and they haven't cut out my tongue and taken away my fingers to type and all these different things, I can still do something. I can give life to something, or I can choose to put my efforts elsewhere. And this is why we talk, is ultimately we try and educate about situations and things up here. But at the end of the day, we need to get serious about what we're doing and what we're giving life to through our actions. Are we feeding the monster, or are we choosing to put our efforts, energy, time, and things elsewhere, and we start to starve it? Because as we starve it, it has to change. And this is what happens. And we, as a people, then it's incumbent on us to go out and talk to others, to teach them, to start to move them away from this. And if you look at Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, that was her notion in it was, well, stop feeding the system, walk away from it. I'm not saying that exactly, but I'm saying we have agency as to what we do or don't do each day. And our efforts, our choices, they feed something. And we can give life to good things. We can give life to systems of checks and balances. There's so many people working on these things. There's so many people trying, and we don't even listen to them. We don't give them the time of day. We just want to listen to the big talking heads that are part of the public-private partnerships, all those types of things. They say, no, we need to choose to do what's necessary to find the correct information, to go through it, share it, carry it on. But these things grow. And I'm 100% believer that God's with us. I believe this is God's country. And I believe very strongly he wants it to survive. And he will bless our efforts if we do what we're supposed to. So that's to me one of the big takeaways is, well, let's start trying. Let's do things. Let's talk. Let's go up and make some noise, different things, and let it spread, see where it goes.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I hope we really build a good, thriving community around this because I would love to get more input from people who are serious thinkers about the Constitution, how to uphold it, how to preserve it, how to restore checks and balances. And I agree with you. I think if we were under monarchy, we should still be trying to restore checks and balances, create them, have that pushback, and just by our choices, because the adversary can't. He's got limited munitions in a sense, right? And all of this warfare of words is ultimately, you know, he will eventually exhaust his arguments. That's why there's final judgment, right? And we've got to outlast every machination to the contrary. Well, thank you so
Yep.
much for joining. And I know you've got to drop off. I'll probably just do a little outro in just a second here, but great to have you
Okay.
here. I hope we get to have more conversations like this. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for joining.
Yeah. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you. And
Bye.
yeah, follow Austin Hepworth. You got a website? Anything you want to point people to?
Um, yeah, most of my stuff comes up on, I guess, my YouTube channel right now, which is youtube.com/@I believe first, because I do believe that belief is the basis for what we have to do first. So I believe first is the YouTube channel. There's quite a few videos there. And then I will be getting to austinhepworth.com and updating that. I haven't updated it yet since running for office, but there will be more articles and things on there as well. But right now it's mainly YouTube.
All right, sounds great. Yeah, so anybody watching, please go over there and subscribe. Look at his great content, and yeah, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Seth.
All right, take care. All right, so I'm just going to do a brief little outro, just on some thoughts, just trying to wrap up here. Austin was very gracious and generous to share his time with us, and I just want to share a few more thoughts over the next 3 minutes or so. First of all, just this is something that got me going here. Ezra Taft Benson said, "The Constitution will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by the citizens of this nation who love and cherish freedom, men and women who will subscribe to and abide the principles of the Constitution." And I just love those two words there, subscribe to and abide. I think that's a lot of what Austin was talking about. We have a choice every day. There's a really great talk by Randall Ridd called The Choice Generation, and he boils it right down to, he gets us right in our conscience, and he boils it right down to the things you choose to click on, the things you choose to look at in your search results and so on, the things you choose to search for. So many of our choices, I think the adversary, I know the adversary is really determined to undermine our awareness of cause and effect and our control over our choices, and just make us think we're powerless and so on. Like, we do just have to, go along with every time some pundit or politician, somebody on social media who's got a huge platform, really wants you to go and support some nominee or candidate. Take a step back, question that, go do some research for yourself. If all it is pressure and you've got to do this, and then we're just unthinking goons. But so we got to subscribe to and abide the principles of the Constitution. Got to really, like you said at the beginning of this broadcast, cultivate a desire. And that's something that, as I've read through the Constitution, I've read through it before, I don't know how many times, but like, there are so many things like this past year and over the past several years, and even just the past few weeks, where I'm just like, whoa, that's why that's there. And I have this newfound, this newly created appreciation for it, because I'm just like, wow, this is so good. I love this. Why don't we just, stick with this? Why don't we just eat this up? Because this is such a good principle, and I really want to use those materials and build my eternal abode out of them. I want to build my abode out of them here on earth, and uphold them for the benefit of myself and others. But and I kept on talking up juries. There's this picture is from the Joseph Smith Prophet of the Restoration movie, and this is a real person, General Donovan. This guy on the left, General Lucas, ordered Joseph Smith and I think his brother Hiram shot in a very unconstitutional, very immoral fake trial, and was just basically going to murder them. And this guy was his subordinate, and he just said, "I will not enforce your order. I will not obey your order, and I will hold you accountable before an earthly tribunal if you execute these men." And so that's the power of nullification at work right there. That's an example of you're a public officer, you're whoever, you're in the army, you're just an ordinary citizen, whoever you are. Somebody asks you to do something that's immoral, wrong, unconstitutional, you just say no, you refuse, and you threaten to hold them accountable if they try to enforce it, because you can. You can do both of those things. You can have the shield and the sword. And that's what we desperately need, is people of conscience who have a shield and a sword. It's so much like the gun control arguments, guys, like with the Second Amendment. You would never willingly give up your right to defend yourself. Why would we give up our right to act as a check on tyranny, on injustice? So we do need to have that shield, jury trials, and that sword of the grand jury. We need to be able to both protect people from injustice, nullify unjust acts, and proactively go, this is done. That's not mob justice. That's the due process the Constitution requires, is you do what's right. That's what the Constitution is supposed to embody and amplify. Hold people accountable, and so on. All right, through the proper channels. And he did reference as well, this is Some people refer to this as the White Horse prophecy, which is a later embellishment, I guess, of this. But this is actually from the Journal of Discourses 4th of July celebration in 1854, so 10 years after Joseph Smith passed away, not, tons of decades, dozens of years. And he actually does specifically state here, will the Constitution be destroyed? No, it will be held inviolate by this people. And as Joseph Smith said, the time will come when the destiny of the nation will hang upon a single thread. At that critical juncture, this people will step forth and save it from the threatened destruction. It will be so. And there's so much more in here that we need. We need words. We need to nourish our minds and our spirits with words of truth and soberness. So I recommend to you the words of the prophets, including those that are long since past. And if you have questions about republicanism and what the Constitution means and how to uphold liberty, there are a lot of resources there. We just never even read them. And yeah, got to fix our education, fix our morals, like Austin was saying, in order to make any of this work. We can stand up and do the things that we should do. And Ezra Taft Benson said years ago, back in the 1960s, that the people of the church would have been able to, at that time, if they had had the knowledge and the morality, personal discipline, they could have stood up and rescued the Constitution then and there. So now's the time. Now's the time to go hit those books and answer those questions and figure out how to reconcile these, potentially difficult principles that others have wrestled with and have let a giant monster into our lives. We need to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. So checks and balances. Thanks everyone for watching and listening. And again, my heart goes out to everybody who's having a tough time right now. So I just want you to know, whatever your political disposition is, we do have a great need for civility, communication. I love what the prophets have said. Revelation is scattered among us. And we're seeing that now. Got some great input from Austin tonight. All right, well, thanks for watching, everyone. Good night, and we'll see you again next time.